amazing images from inside the human body. They're made possible through medical imaging, a life-saving technology that began with the accidental discovery of the X-ray. Now, medical imaging, the voyage inward on Modern Marvels.
Here is the baby's hand and the baby's face. Here's the eye, and you can see some movement. The baby's sucking his thumb here.
From the womb to old age.
Well, what we're looking at is a human pelvis, which has a fracture on one side and is normal on the other side.
Medical imaging has allowed doctors to see deep inside the body, nearly eliminating the need of exploratory surgery.
I don't think anybody really understands how life-saving and how fantastic medicine has become as a result of the imaging devices. It's been an amazing, just an amazing impact on medicine.
The technology that has made medical miracles routine was discovered by accident, completely unexpectedly. The last quarter of the 19th century saw an explosion of technological achievement. Motion pictures, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, Thomas Edison's phonograph. Physicists believed they were on the verge of understanding everything about the invisible forces that powered the universe. But then a group of scientists started experimenting with electromagnetism. They correctly suspected that a connection between electrical particles and magnetic fields resulted in a spectrum of energy waves, including visible light.
They wanted to find out exactly what electricity was. They knew that electromagnetism was the same general phenomenon, but they didn't know all the little details. So they were trying to find out the various particles that appeared when you set up an electric charge.
To accomplish this, scientists utilized fragile, oddly shaped hand-blown glass tubes. These are all variations of a tube created by an English chemist, William Crookes, in 1876. Crookes conceived a method of pumping nearly all the air out of the tube, creating a vacuum. When electric current was applied to the metal electrodes at either end of the tube, cathode rays, later identified as electrons, would cause the tube to glow and the plates to turn green. Exploring cathode rays was the passion of a physics professor at Germany's University of Würzburg, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. Röntgen lived above his laboratory with wife Bertha. On November 8, 1895, he made a discovery that would change the world. Portrayed here in a 1930s promotional film made by General Electric, the 50-year-old physicist was experimenting with cathode rays using a variation of a Crookes tube. He noticed a mysterious greenish glow from across the room, too far away to be a cathode ray.
Röntgen just stopped. He stopped everything and pursued this exploration of this mysterious phenomenon.
Röntgen began working day and night, taking his meals and even sleeping in the lab. An avid photographer, he began aiming the tubes at photographic plates. Röntgen found that when certain objects like coins or steel weights were placed between the plates and the rays, they would imprint bizarre shadow images. Röntgen knew he was producing a new kind of ray, and amazingly it was capable of penetrating opaque objects such as the steel barrel of his hunting rifle. Finally, Röntgen held his hand between the rays and a fluorescent screen. What he saw was shocking. Wilhelm Röntgen was staring at the skeletal shadow of his own hand.
It is rumored that when he finally, after a couple of weeks, told Bertha she better come and look, and Bertha was getting a little bit curious or annoyed, but he hadn't been eating his meals. He would rush right back to the lab, whatever he did, and he finally said, "You're not going to believe this."
Röntgen placed Bertha's hand in front of the ray and captured the haunting image of her wedding ring floating upon a bony finger.
And it is said that she said, when she saw her hand, "I have seen my death." Because up until this time, no one ever saw bones unless they were bones of dead people.
A month later, Röntgen submitted a handwritten account of his discovery, along with a photo of the X-ray image, to the Physico-Medical Society of Würzburg. He identified the ray as X for unknown. Within weeks, both Röntgen and the X-ray were worldwide phenomena. In 1901, Röntgen's discovery would be awarded with the first Nobel Prize ever granted in physics. His mysterious X-rays were soon recognized by physicists for what they really were: electromagnetic waves with a length about 1/1000th that of visible light. But to the Western world, they were much more. Within months of their discovery, X-rays would impact healthcare, the legal system, and forensics. They would be seen as everything from a tool of the occult to a novelty amusement. And they would fire the opening shot of a social and sexual revolution. Wilhelm Röntgen published his first report on the discovery of the X-ray on the same day the Lumiere brothers screened the first motion picture to a live audience, December 28, 1895. When Wilhelm Röntgen discovered the X-ray in 1895, he sought neither fame nor fortune. Instead of filing for a patent, he shared his method for creating X-rays with the world. It was a simple process, and it spread like wildfire.
I think it's fair to say that never before, and perhaps never since, has there been a discovery that went from innovation, so to speak, to implementation so quickly as with the X-ray. It was put into clinical use literally within days of its announcement, and in the space of a year, 1,000 separate articles were published, both in scientific and non-scientific journals, on the use of the X-ray.
On January 19th, 1896, less than 1 month after Röntgen published his discovery, 14-year-old Eddie McCarthy took a hard spill while ice skating on the Connecticut River in Hanover, New Hampshire. Eddie's doctor, Gilman Frost, suspected a fractured wrist, but had no way of knowing for sure.
And at that time, a fracture was a clinical diagnosis. Nobody had ever really seen a fracture unless the bones were sticking out through the skin.
Dr. Frost took Eddie to Reed Hall, then the physics building at nearby Dartmouth College. There, Frost's brother Edwin, a physics professor, had been testing the school's large collection of vacuum tubes in search of one capable of generating the amazing X-rays described by Röntgen. He made an X-ray impression of different objects, including a pocket knife, using this tube. The Frost brothers then X-rayed Eddie's wrist, using this machine, still on display at Dartmouth. First, the wrist is placed on top of a photographic plate. Current is generated by a transformer called an ABS coil.
The low voltage source would come in and be amplified by this transformer, and then the voltage would be applied across this tube. Now, the thing that made this tube very special was this oblique mica plate in the middle of the tube, which had a metallic coating on it. And it was the metallic coating that actually generated the X-rays.
early X-rays required extremely long exposure times. Young Eddie had to hold his wrist still for nearly 30 minutes. Fortunately, his discomfort paid off, as the resulting radiograph confirmed Dr. Frost's diagnosis of a fractured wrist.
It's very hard to see the fracture, but it's there.
Eddie McCarthy's X-ray was significant for two reasons. It was the first clinical X-ray made in America, and the photograph of the event is believed to be the first ever taken of a scientific experiment in progress. The rapid use of the X-ray to peer inside the body was matched only by the speed with which others tried to improve them. Besides being the era's most celebrated inventor, Thomas Edison might have been its most ingenious marketer. He and his team went to work immediately after reading of Röntgen's discovery. They produced more powerful tubes by using thinner glass, which allowed more X-rays to pass through at a faster rate. Their efforts quickly led to the fluoroscope, a handheld pyramid-shaped box with a calcium tungstate-coated screen on one end and an eyepiece on the other. When the fluoroscope was held in front of an X-ray beam, one could see real-time images. Edison dramatically demonstrated the wonder of the fluoroscope to enormous crowds at New York's National Electrical Exposition in 1896.
Edison was a showman. People would have to stand on a long line, and then they would walk into a very dark room which had these eerie colored lights, very dark in the corners, like an Egyptian tomb.
Each visitor held the fluoroscope to their eyes and saw their very own bones.
It was an extraordinary experience, and there were people who, when they would get into the room, would suddenly be terrified and they would refuse to go through with it. The people who were afraid said the same thing that Bertha Röntgen was supposed to have said, is they were afraid of seeing their own death.
By bathing his exhibit space in what was described as Egyptian darkness with blood-red lamps, Edison was also giving many in the crowd a first look at his most famous invention, the electric light. But the atmosphere he created was part of a marketing ploy based on the public's growing fascination with the supernatural.
Bill, are you here? Thank you.
The end of the 19th century was a time when spiritualism was a very popular idea in many circles. And the idea that there was a connection between this world, the real world that we can see, and an invisible world of different dimensions was very popular. The X-ray came out of nowhere, and it was invisible, and it showed that there was a great deal in the world that was invisible to the naked eye that could be seen or sensed if only you had the right password.
While some believed the X-ray could open the door to a higher dimension, others feared its power to penetrate a more personal one.
There were lots of advertisements for lead-lined underwear so that you wouldn't be, at risk of walking down the street and having someone look through your underwear with an X-ray.
Such potential exposure was alarming to a Western society anchored by Victorian principles. New technology was already threatening those values. The affection displayed in this short kinetoscope film made by Thomas Edison was considered scandalous, but the X-ray provided the ultimate threat.
Proper women wore many, many layers of petticoats, and their skirts went down to the bottom of their shoes because the ankle was considered a very erotic thing to see. Suddenly you have a machine that makes clothes irrelevant because you can look right through the clothes, through your skin, until you got to your bones. And this was shocking. If the X-ray was going to remove all these layers of opaque substances and enable you to see right through to the bone. When you were exposed, you were naked to the bone.
X-rays also diminished the authority doctors enjoyed in diagnosing their patients.
Before the X-ray, most doctors were not usually attacked in court for the way they did their work. They weren't second-guessed. With the coming of the X-ray, suddenly you could see if a doctor had made a proper diagnosis or not.
Surgeon W.W. Grant of Denver was renowned for having performed the first appendectomy in the United States. But when he misdiagnosed a patient's broken hip as only a contusion, he was sued. The patient had an X-ray taken that revealed the fracture. He won the legal battle to have it admitted as evidence, and then won the case. The onus of malpractice would haunt the medical profession from that day forward. Already a useful tool of both doctors and lawyers, the newly discovered X-ray could also be used by coroners. A horrible tragedy in Paris would reveal its importance in the field of forensics. On May 4th, 1897, a throng of 6,000 people attended an elite philanthropic bazaar. The highlight was an exhibition of Thomas Edison's kinescope, the precursor to large-screen motion pictures. When a kinescope wire shorted, flames rapidly spread across the wood floor to large decorative flats that tragically blocked many of the hall's exits. More than 200 prominent French citizens perished, burned beyond recognition. Yet they could be identified by pre-existing fractures and other injuries, thanks to X-rays. The ability to identify the dead, to see broken bones, or to locate a spray of buckshot were revolutionary advances for science and medicine. But looming on the horizon was the X-ray's tragic dark side. There has probably never been a medical procedure as widely implemented with virtually no testing than the X-ray. In addition to providing a view inside the body, the wondrous new rays were even used to remove skin blemishes such as moles, acne, and birthmarks. In one of the more frightening chapters of X-ray usage, some doctors believed that X-rays could help alleviate America's racial problem.
It was in 1904, and there were newspaper articles from all over the country, from Berkeley, California, from New York City, from Philadelphia, of different doctors announcing that they could turn Negroes white by exposing them to X-rays. This was a period when the Klan was really growing, when lynchings were epidemic in the South. And so here you have people of goodwill saying, oh, we'll solve the problem. We won't have any more black people. We'll turn them all white. And that this would be relatively harmless. I don't think anybody really thought they were going to kill all the black people.
At least 2 doctors published reports that they had successfully used X-rays to lighten the skin of African Americans. Though within a year, more enlightened doctors announced the procedure would surely end in severe burns and a painful death. Further accounts of such treatment disappeared from all records a short time later. The bizarre episode was indicative of how little people knew about the X-ray and its deadly side effect, radiation poisoning. Ironically, during the X-ray's glorious early years, French scientists Pierre and Marie Curie were making great strides in isolating the natural element radium. Radiation is the word they use to identify the invisible energy waves emitted by radium. Exposure caused blisters and burns that never healed, and in many cases led to cancer. Marie Curie would eventually succumb to her many years of such exposure, dying of leukemia in 1934 at age 67. But her pioneering research of radioactivity would save countless lives. Unfortunately for many others, the realization that X-rays produced an artificial form of radiation would not be discovered until it was too late. This film, produced by the United States Army, illustrated the danger.
Doctors and some technologists who routinely put their hands in the X-ray beam when diagnoses were being attempted, and did so repeatedly, began to notice that they were getting X-ray burns, and some of them developed cancers in the areas that had been exposed to X-rays over a period of months or years.
Even though evidence was mounting that X-ray exposure caused skin damage, the tremendous medical benefits instilled a reluctance to examine the problem. Instead, X-ray burns were considered idiosyncratic.
That was a term that was used then a lot. That they would say some people are just more prone to respond to radiation, that they might be allergic to radiation. So maybe my neighbor, who was a radiologist, dies his horrible death from radiation-induced cancer, but he was prone to it. I come from better stock. I'm not going to have that allergy. I'll be all right.
X-ray technicians were soon identified by the black glove they wore over whichever badly scarred hand was used to test the potency of their X-ray beams. Their agonizing deaths would be remembered by a monument in Germany called the X-ray Martyrs. Perhaps the most famous martyr was Thomas Edison's most trusted assistant, Clarence Daly. Daly was constantly operating Edison's fluoroscopes and other X-ray machines. Soon, he began developing sores around his eyes, his hairline receded, and his fingers developed such vicious sores they had to be amputated one by one.
He died a horrible death. He was in agony. He'd lost most of both arms. And it was just so devastating that Edison swore off X-rays then and would have nothing to do with it.
25 years later, only months before his own death, Edison was suffering from severe abdominal pain. His doctor suspected an ulcer and requested X-rays. The 84-year-old inventor refused. They were, in his mind, simply too dangerous. However, X-rays would become considerably safer thanks to a scientist at General Electric, William Coolidge.
Generally speaking, the greater the penetrating power and the greater the intensity of the X-rays produced, the shorter the time to make a radiograph.
In 1913, Coolidge devised a new X-ray tube. The Coolidge tube allowed doctors to more accurately pinpoint the focus of the X-rays and to control the amount of radiation emitted. Lead casings around the tubes prevented any spillage. Further benefits would come with the use of intensifying screens, which converted X-ray energy into light energy, reducing a patient's exposure time from half an hour to only seconds. The bulky lead-lined protective suits worn by some X-ray technicians gave way to lead aprons and goggles. Now, not only safer, X-rays were becoming more effective. Contrast agents such as barium were used with fluoroscopes. When swallowed by patients, the barium would provide views that went beyond the bones to actual organs. The next great advance in X-ray technology would not occur until the 1960s, and surprisingly, the Beatles would play an important role in its development.
Here we see 3 babies within this woman's womb. And then right here is where we can see all 3 of the babies in 3 different sacks.
In the 1970s, medical imaging took its place on page 1 of the family photo album, thanks to ultrasound. This completely safe form of imaging uses sound waves to provide parents their first glimpse at baby, or babies. The idea of using sound waves to create an image is not a new one. Pierre Curie explored the possibility in 1877. But public demand for such technology was precipitated by the events of a calm ocean night in 1912. If only the Titanic had a way of using sound waves rather than mere sight to detect icebergs, the infamous disaster might never have occurred. Because of the Titanic tragedy, interest in Curie's sound wave research was renewed, both in hopes of preventing a future catastrophe and actually locating the sunken luxury liner. However, those efforts would have to be postponed. The outbreak of World War I 2 years later presented an even more pressing problem: the need to detect enemy submarines. Attempts to do so using sound wave technology were made, though they were not completely effective.
German submarines operating off our east coast sank 79 merchant ships in the 2 months following our declaration of war on Germany, December 11, 19...
In World War II, the Allies depended on a more sophisticated method called sound navigation and ranging, or sonar. But it was not until the end of the war that strides could be made toward the ultrasound imaging of today.
When the war was over, there was lots of Army surplus, Navy surplus stuff around, which they were practically giving away. And it turned out that there were lots of doctors who had been drafted. And there were doctors in the United States, there were doctors in England, there were doctors in Japan, there were doctors in Germany, all of whom kind of figured that this equipment could some way be adapted to look inside the body.
One of the most successful attempts was made at the University of Colorado Medical School by radiologist Douglas Howry. Working out of his own basement, Howry combined sonar with another recent innovation, television. The result was a somascope. The somascope relied on a thin crystal quartz to create sound waves. They could penetrate a tub of water, scan an object, and send an echo back to a television tube, producing an image. Another wartime innovation, the computer, would advance somascope technology to ultrasound. Now, doctors could penetrate organs, study the beating heart, or see inside the womb without using radiation. The computer would also open the door to the next generation of imaging devices. In the 1960s, X-ray was the world's primary imaging tool, and the Beatles its favorite rock and roll band. Both would affect the future of medical imaging. X-rays had limitations. The brain was difficult to image because it was blocked by the skull. The only way to X-ray it was through a painful and dangerous process called encephalography, in which the brain was injected with air.
Slowly breathe in and out, okay? Good.
The advent of computerized tomography, or the CAT scan, would not only image the brain, but turn ordinary X-rays into vivid 3D images of bone and soft tissue. This revolution in medicine may have never come about, however, without a revolution in the music industry. In the early 60s, the Beatles were well on their way to becoming the most successful band in history. Their recording company, Britain's EMI, used some of the staggering profits to allow one of their engineers, a self-described tinkerer, to develop ideas that would take advantage of new computer technology. The engineer, Godfrey Hounsfield, began dreaming of ways for computers to make 3D images of objects inside a box. Soon he turned the challenge into producing 3D images of a brain inside a skull. The CAT scanner places the X-ray coil in a rotating donut-shaped carriage. capable of taking cross-sectional images from dozens of angles. Computers analyze and assemble all the X-rays into a single image. In 1972, EMI, with virtually no experience in medical electronics, began developing the CAT scan based on Hounsfield's design.
All of a sudden, we have a vehicle that allows us to image the brain, to see the brain substance, the subarachnoid spaces, the ventricles of the brain, to detect and localize and characterize tumors. The density discrimination between computed tomography and ordinary X-rays is many, many hundreds of fold greater.
By 1977, EMI had sold 700 of the units, including one to George Washington Medical Center in Washington, D.C. On March 31st, 1981, 26-year-old John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 exploding bullets at President Ronald Reagan.
I didn't know I was shot. In fact, I was still asking, what was that noise? I thought it was firecrackers. And it was only then that I felt a paralyzing pain, and I learned that the bullet had hit me. When I walked in, they were just concluding a meeting in the hospital of all the doctors associated with the hospital. True, when I saw all those doctors around me, too, I said I hope they were all Republicans.
Wounded in the chest, Reagan's life was saved by using conventional X-rays to locate the bullet and skilled surgery to remove it. But far more gravely wounded was his press secretary, James Brady. Saving Brady from a near-fatal head wound was a dramatic and difficult challenge. The attending radiologist, David Davis, might have been helpless if not for the CAT scan.
Brady was immediately placed in the CT scanner and scanned. And in a very short period of time, the scan pictures came out, and it was obvious that Brady had a very large blood clot in his right frontal lobe. He had a bullet wound entering his forehead and a blood clot in his right frontal lobe. And neither the neurosurgeon nor I would have given you much hope that Brady would have survived at that very moment. It was pretty scary because he had a big clot. But the neurosurgeon said, I'm going to move on it, and he was raced to the OR, and because he knew exactly what was going on, the CT scan, it wasn't a case of exploring where the lesion was, he knew where it was.
The CAT scan helped save Brady's life. Ironically, it also helped save the life of his assailant. During his trial, Hinckley's attorneys broke new legal ground by submitting a CAT scan of their client's brain. They claimed it showed evidence of schizophrenia. Though CAT scans have later proven incapable of detecting such a disorder, the presentation swayed the jury. They found Hinckley legally insane, sparing him the death penalty. The computer formulas that made the sharp 3D images of the CAT scan possible opened the door to newer imaging techniques that would provide an even deeper view of human anatomy. In 1971, the combined efforts of a research physician, Raymond Damadian, and chemist Paul Lauterbur resulted in medical imaging's next great advance, magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. MRI images are produced from inside a large cylinder similar to a CAT scanner. Inside the cylinder is a magnet capable of producing a powerful electromagnetic field. Since the atoms that make up human beings are electrical in nature, they are disrupted when the magnet is activated. Radio waves are then pulsated through the body. They gather information about the atoms as they return to their normal alignment once the magnet is deactivated.
And then the signal that comes back from that pulsation is constructed into an image of your organs or your brain or your ventricles or your knee or whatever it is that we're looking at. It's as simple as that. There is no X-ray. You have no radiation from it. It's harmless as far as anybody knows.
While CAT scans provide excellent images of bone and soft tissue, MRIs can see inside the bones. They produce images of blood vessels, cartilage, bone marrow, and ligaments, and are especially useful for detecting brain tumors. In 1993, it became the primary tool for a monumental effort to map the brain.
Brain mapping is defined in its title. It is the opportunity and the ways that we can map the human brain in health and disease, define its anatomy, and then understand its functions and how it works.
The University of California at Los Angeles is the lead center of the International Consortium for Brain Mapping. By studying thousands of MRIs of human brains, the consortium is gathering data that can have profound effects on medicine. For example, they can witness the brain's response to various medications, or actually see the early stages of various diseases.
We can look at the change in blood flow as a reflection of areas in the brain that are changing their activity, either up, more activity, or down. And that's what those techniques tell us. They tell us where in the brain something is changing when the person's doing a particular task. One of the really exciting parts about functional imaging of the brain is that you can have a way of understanding where in the brain things are happening and relate to certain behaviors. We can study learning directly. We can say, okay, how does the brain learn this? And when is it most efficient at learning that? Age 3, age 50, age 70? And we can pass on to the educators the real answers of how and when the brain learns something. That may have very important implications. Obvious ones are how we educate our children.
While MRI scans help us understand the brain through structural imaging, another computer-dependent imaging device can monitor metabolism in cells, spotting degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's. Dr. Michelle Tur-Pagosian headed a program at Washington University in St. Louis that resulted in the first PET scanner in 1975. PET, short for positron emission topography, creates images by tracing small amounts of radioactive materials that are injected into the bloodstream. Inside a PET scanner are large rings of more than 20,000 detectors that work in concert to image the path of the radioactive substance.
It has penetrating radiation, like the X-rays are inside of you. And so the X-rays come out and they hit the detectors, and those detectors record every single event. And then those events don't really look like a picture. You have to actually reconstruct it, and then what you actually make is a 3D picture of your insides.
Once again, to the untrained eye, the image produced by a PET scan does not look as clear as a CAT scan or even an X-ray. Instead, doctors interpret the image by how the radioactive tracer interacts with the body's chemistry. In doing so, they can actually see evidence of disease not visible through other imaging devices.
Everybody has said for years that you cannot diagnose Alzheimer's disease except by autopsy, where you cut out the brain and look at it. Well, since 1980, we've been able to see Alzheimer's disease very easily with the PET scan. It just turns out that big parts of the brain are essentially missing because that's what's being destroyed.
With such powerful imaging devices at their disposal, doctors and scientists were seeing more of the human body than ever before. And with the advent of the internet, so would the rest of the world. The magnetic field created by most MRI scanners is 10,000 times greater than that of the Earth. These amazing images are one of a kind. They are from the first three-dimensional computer model of a whole human being, a virtual cadaver. It's called the Visible Human Project, and its purpose is to provide anatomy students with a model that can be sliced in thousands of different angles and put back together again.
That's important for teaching whole body anatomy, as you teach a medical student they all interact with whole bodies. You want them to see what a body looks like and be able to visualize what things deep to the surface of the body are. They only see patients generally from the skin or even from the clothing, and to visualize where the upper left quadrant of your liver is relative to your abdomen, how deep it is, where it is anterior to posterior, is important to get that three-dimensional view across to people, and being able to reconstruct this in the computer was the driving force here.
The visible human is a marriage of CAT scan, MRI, and digital photography. It was constructed at the University of Colorado and is freely available on the internet to anyone wishing to digitally dissect it. One of the more bizarre challenges to creating the visible human was finding its real-life model. A young male cadaver in as good a physical condition as possible. The ideal choice would be a drug overdose victim, somebody with no visible signs of trauma and with organs not suitable for donation. 39-year-old Paul Jernigan of Waco, Texas, fit the bill. When he killed a 75-year-old man in an attempt to steal a microwave oven, Jernigan was sentenced to die by lethal injection. The execution was carried out on August 5th, 1993. Having willed his body to science, Jernigan was airshipped to Colorado soon after his death. CAT scans and MRI scans were immediately taken by Spitzer's team. Next, the body was encased in a special gel and frozen beneath cakes of dry ice. Then came the hard part. The rock-solid frozen cadaver would have to be cut into quarters so that it could fit into a custom-made slicing device called a chiromacrotome.
Then each quarter is then encased or made into a large ice cube. We poured into a mold, gelatin, which surrounds that part of the body, and make a 20-inch tall by less than 22-inch wide by less than 14-inch deep ice cube, if you will, that contains this specimen.
The cadaverous cube is then placed into the chiromacrotome. 1 millimeter at a time is sliced off the block.
Here we've frozen everything solid as a rock. The skull and the brain are both the same kind of hardness. So when we cut, they react the same way. And you don't have different kinds of distortion of the brain and the skull.
After each slice is removed, the cube is sprayed with alcohol to melt the frost. Next, a digital photograph is taken. More than 1,800 slices and photos are made in all. The images are then stacked and programmed into an imaging computer, where virtual slices in any direction can be made by users. The visible human can also be explored entirely through MRI or CAT scan images. The project's directors see even greater possibilities for future virtual humans.
Right now, it's a good simulator for a cadaver. It acts like a cadaver. And then we'll keep moving until it acts more like a live human. A man that has a beating heart, a man that has blood flowing through his body. We're not there today, and it's not happening today, but that will happen.
Such a future may be close at hand, thanks to rapid advances in digital technology and an unquenchable thirst to witness the magnificent inner workings of the human body. Wilhelm Röntgen could never have ever envisioned that his dogged exploration of a mysterious glow would lay a foundation for later scientists who would invent a wide array of powerful imaging techniques. Their genius will surely inspire the future of medical imaging, one that holds promise of seeing deeper, further, and with exquisite clarity.
Tonight on Tech Tuesday.
We're taking technology to new depths and digging for the mother lode.
If you thought that prospectors knew the tricks of their trade, think again.
They had no knowledge of mining whatsoever.
What ridiculous array of tools did these hard-scrabble money grubbers use to find their fortune? Find out on Gold Rush Tech. Tonight at 8 on the History Channel.